There's a moving truck parked outside a house on a quiet residential street, and if you drove past it, you might think, "Oh, that's nice. Somebody's moving in. A young family, maybe. New chapter, fresh start." But that's not what's happening. That truck isn't bringing anybody into that house. It's taking someone out, and the someone is me. I'm standing on the porch of the house I raised 3 children in, the house my husband and I bought in 1987, with a mortgage so tight we ate spaghetti 4 nights a week for the first 2 years just to make the payment, and I'm holding 2 suitcases, not boxes, suitcases, because apparently that's all I was told I'd need for now. In my other hand, I'm holding a set of keys, my keys, to my own front door, and in about 4 minutes, I'm going to hand them to my son. Now, here's the thing. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I think a lot of you watching this know exactly what that porch feels like, even if your own story looks different. That feeling of standing at the threshold of your own life, holding the very thing that used to mean you belonged somewhere, and realizing somebody else has decided you don't anymore. Let me tell you a quick story before I get into how I ended up on that porch, because I think it'll help you understand who I was before all this happened. When I was 7 years old, my own grandmother, Rose, lived with us. And I remember, clear as anything, being furious at 7 years old, because my father raised his voice at her one night about something small, a burnt dinner, I think it was. And I remember my grandmother didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just quietly went to her room. And I sat outside her door that night, 7 years old, and I told her, "When I grow up, nobody is ever going to make you feel like you don't belong somewhere." I didn't understand, at 7, that the promise I was making to my grandmother was really a promise I'd need someone to make to me one day. I thought love like that only had one direction, that you gave it to the people older than you, and the people younger than you gave it back automatically, like it was owed to you simply for being family. I am 66 years old now, and I am going to tell you exactly how I went from being the woman who held that entire house together, the one who paid off that mortgage, who nursed my husband through his final years, who raised 3 children and half-raised 5 grandchildren, to standing on my own front porch with 2 suitcases and a set of keys I was about to give away. But I'm also going to tell you what happened after. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you when you're standing at the lowest point of your life. Sometimes, the door closing behind you isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the only thing that could have opened the one in front of you. Stay with me. This one's going to take a little while to tell properly, but I promise you, by the end, you'll understand why I don't regret a single day of it, not even that one. My name is Eleanor. I'm 66 years old, born and raised in a small town about an hour outside the city. I worked 35 years, the first several as a civilian secretary on an army base, handling paperwork and correspondence for officers who were often younger than I was even back then, and later as an office manager for a small accounting firm, while my husband Frank worked in construction. We married young, had 3 children close together, and by the time I was 30, our house was already full of noise, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. Frank passed away 11 years ago, heart attack, sudden, no warning. And after that, our big house, the one we'd worked so hard for, became in some ways too quiet, which is exactly how, over the years that followed, it slowly filled back up again. That's where I want to start, because to understand how I ended up on that porch, you first need to understand how full that house used to be and how happy I was to have it that way. Here's the thing about a house you've lived in for almost 40 years. It stops being wood and drywall. It becomes a kind of scrapbook you can walk through. Every room in that house had a memory sitting in the corner of it, quiet, waiting for me to notice it again. The kitchen was where I taught all 3 of my kids to make my mother's pot roast. The staircase had a 4th step that always creaked, and for years I used that creak like a little alarm system whenever the kids tried sneaking out past curfew. The backyard had a tree Frank planted the week our first son, Michael, was born. It's taller than the house now. After Frank passed, that house got quiet in a way I wasn't prepared for. 40 years of noise, and then almost overnight, just me and the hum of the refrigerator. I'll be honest with you, those first couple of years alone were some of the hardest of my life. Harder, in some ways, than what came later. Grief has a way of making even a big house feel like it's shrinking in on you. So when my eldest son, Michael, called me about 4 years after Frank passed and asked if he, his wife, and their 2 kids could move in just for a little while. He'd lost his job. They were behind on rent. It was supposed to be 6 months, maybe 8. I didn't hesitate. Not for 1 second. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. And here's the thing. Those first few months with Michael's family in the house were, genuinely, some of the happiest I'd had since Frank passed. The house woke back up. There were footsteps on the stairs again. There was a reason to cook a big dinner on Sundays. My grandkids, Ava and Tyler, 6 and 9 at the time, would come thundering down in the mornings and pile onto my bed before school, and I remember thinking, I got my house back. Not the way I expected to get it back, but I got it back. 6 months turned into a year. A year turned into 2. And somewhere in there, my daughter Rachel, going through a rough patch in her marriage, asked if she and her 2 kids could stay for a while too, just until things settled down. And again, I said yes, because what was I going to say? No, there isn't room in my big, quiet house for my own daughter and grandchildren. By the time my youngest, David, moved back in a year after that, he was between apartments, saving up for a down payment on his own place. I had, without ever quite deciding to, become the anchor of a house with 3 generations under one roof. 9 people, most days. Sometimes 11, when David's girlfriend stayed over. Now, I want to pause here because I think this is important for you to understand about me so the rest of this story makes sense. I loved it. I want to be honest with you. I loved every chaotic, loud, exhausting minute of it. I loved making breakfast for 7 kids some mornings. I loved being the one who knew where everything was, who remembered every allergy and every teacher's name and every bedtime story. At 62, 63 years old, I felt more needed than I had in a decade. And if you're my age, you know exactly how good that feeling is, being needed. It's like a coat you didn't know you were cold without. What I didn't understand, what I wouldn't understand until much, much later, is that being needed and being valued are 2 very different things. And I had quietly, without ever noticing the shift, become the first, without anybody making sure I still had the second. I retired at 60 years old, after 35 years of working, the last 12 of them as office manager for a small accounting firm downtown. And I want to tell you, that last day of work felt like the finish line of a marathon. I didn't even realize I'd been running that long. The girls at the office threw me a little party. Cake, balloons, a card everybody signed. My boss, a kind man named Gerald who I'd worked under for over a decade, gave a little speech about how the office wouldn't run the same without me. And I drove home that day with the windows down, even though it was October and a little too cold for it, just because I wanted to feel the air. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the part where it all gets easier. Here's the thing about retirement that nobody quite prepares you for, especially if you're the kind of woman, and I think a lot of you watching this are, who spent her whole life being useful. Retirement isn't just the end of a job, it's the end of a role. For 35 years, when somebody asked me what I did, I had an answer. I was somebody who went somewhere every morning and did something that mattered. And when that ends, there's a strange kind of quiet that moves in, even in a house as full as mine was. For the first few months, it was wonderful. I finally had time to really be present with the grandkids, picking them up from school, helping with homework at the kitchen table, baking cookies on a random Tuesday just because I could. I thought, this is what I worked 35 years for, this exact thing. But here's where it started to shift, and it was so gradual that if you'd asked me to point to the exact day it began, I honestly couldn't have told you. It started with money, small comments at first. Rachel mentioning, almost offhand, over dinner, that the grocery bill for 9 people was a lot, now that it's not just splitting between working adults. My pension and Social Security gave me a fixed, modest income, enough for me alone, comfortably, but not what I used to bring in with a full-time salary. And I noticed, slowly, that the conversations about everybody chipping in started happening more often when I was in the room, in a way that felt less like practical budgeting and more like a message. Then it was little things around the house, decisions that used to run through me, what to do about the leaking roof, whether to repaint the living room, which contractor to call for the fence, started happening in conversations I wasn't part of. I'd come downstairs and find out Michael had already called someone about the roof. I'd hear Rachel and her husband discussing paint colors for when we redo the living room, like it was already decided, like it was already theirs to redo. I remember one evening, maybe 8 months after I retired, I made a comment at dinner, lighthearted, I thought, about how it felt nice not having anywhere to be in the mornings anymore. And my son David said something that I brushed off at the time, but that sat with me for weeks afterward. He said, "Must be nice not having to worry about pulling your weight anymore, Mom." Now, he laughed when he said it. It was said the way you say something you think is a joke. But here's the thing about jokes in families. Sometimes they're the only place people feel safe putting the truth. And that comment told me something I didn't want to hear yet, that somewhere in that house, a ledger was being kept, and I had gone, in the eyes of some of the people at that table, from an asset to a line item. I want to tell you, I didn't see what was coming. Not really. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself these were my children, the babies I'd raised, fed, stayed up all night with when they were sick, and that whatever small tensions were bubbling up were just the ordinary friction of too many adults under one roof, nothing more. I told myself the house was still mine. The deed was still mine. Frank and I had paid that mortgage off 15 years before he passed. I owned that house free and clear. What I didn't fully understand yet was that owning a house and controlling what happens in it are not always the same thing. Not when you've spent years quietly training the people around you to believe you'll always say yes. It was a Sunday evening, about a year and a half after I retired, when Michael asked if we could all sit down together after the kids went to bed. A family meeting, he called it, and I remember feeling almost pleased by that phrase. A family meeting, all of us together, making decisions as a unit. I made a pot of decaf coffee and put out a plate of the shortbread cookies I always kept on hand for the grandkids, and I sat down at the head of the table in the chair I'd sat in for almost 40 years. Michael did most of the talking. Rachel sat beside him, arms crossed, looking mostly at the table. David leaned against the kitchen counter instead of sitting, which I remember noticing at the time and not understanding why it bothered me. I understand now. It's easier to deliver bad news standing, ready to leave the room, than sitting across from the person you're delivering it to. Michael started by saying how grateful they all were, how much it had meant these past few years having a home to come back to. And then he said the house needed to be restructured. That was his word, restructured. Like the house was a company going through a merger, he said, with the kids getting older, with 3 families' worth of belongings and schedules crammed into one house. Things needed to change. He and Rachel had been talking. The way he said it made clear David had been part of those talks too, even though he was the one standing silent by the counter, about renovating. Opening up the main floor, adding a second kitchen, maybe converting my sewing room and the guest bedroom into a proper in-law suite situation, for when you need more help down the line, Mom. And then he said the part that I felt land in my chest like something physical. He said that in the meantime, while the renovation happened, it might be simpler for everyone if I found a smaller place, an apartment maybe, or, and I remember him saying this so gently, like gentleness could soften what the words actually meant. There are some really nice retirement communities now, Mom, places with activities, people your own age. You wouldn't be so alone in a house full of us running around all day. I sat there, in the chair at the head of my own table, in the house I had owned free and clear for over a decade, and I listened to my 3 children explain to me, kindly, reasonably, as if they'd rehearsed it, and I found out later they had, why it made the most sense for me to be the one to leave. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important. I didn't feel angry, not at first. What I felt was smaller than anger and somehow worse. I felt confused, genuinely confused, the way you feel when the ground shifts slightly under your feet and your body knows something's wrong before your mind catches up. I remember asking, quietly, "This is my house," not even really as a question, just 3 words, like I was checking that the facts hadn't changed while I wasn't looking. And Rachel, my daughter, who I had stayed awake with for 3 nights straight when she had pneumonia as a child, who I had walked down the aisle in place of her father who couldn't make the wedding. Rachel said, "We know it's your house, Mom. That's not what this is about. We just think, at your age, with everything going on, it might genuinely be easier for you." Easier for me. I sat with that phrase for a long time after that conversation ended, turning it over. Easier for me. As though 3 grown adults deciding, without me, that I should leave the home I'd raised them in was somehow a gift they were giving me, rather than the thing it actually was, a decision about my own life and my own property, made by other people, in a room where I was technically present, but somehow not actually consulted. Here's a metaphor that I've thought about a lot since then. You know how sometimes in nature, a tree will support a whole ecosystem, birds nesting in the branches, animals living in the roots, vines climbing up the trunk. And that tree gives and gives year after year until one day the vines have grown so thick and so comfortable that they start choking the very tree that's been holding them up the whole time. The vines don't necessarily mean to. They're just doing what vines do, climbing toward whatever's giving them support. But if nobody ever prunes them back, eventually the tree can't tell anymore where it ends and the vines begin. I had let myself become that tree, and that Sunday night, sitting at my own kitchen table, I understood for the first time in years that nobody in that room, not even me, until that exact moment, remembered that the tree had ever had a shape of its own. I didn't argue that night. I want to tell you I stood up, right then, and said something powerful and dignified that put them all in their place. But that's not what happened. What happened is I said, quietly, "Let me think about it," and I went upstairs to my room, the same room Frank and I had shared for over 30 years, and I sat on the edge of the bed until nearly 2 in the morning, staring at the wall, trying to understand how I had gone from being the center of that house to being an item on its renovation plan. I want to tell you about the 6 weeks between that conversation and the day the moving truck came, because I think those 6 weeks taught me more about my children and about myself than the previous 6 years had. In those 6 weeks, nobody apologized. Nobody said, "Mom, we were out of line. Let's talk about this differently." What happened instead was quieter and in some ways more painful. The decision simply became treated as settled. Michael started bringing home paint samples. Rachel mentioned, casually, a real estate agent friend of hers who could help me find something charming. David, to his credit, seemed the most uncomfortable of the 3. I'd catch him watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read. But he never once said, out loud, "Mom, maybe we shouldn't be doing this." I looked at apartments. I want you to understand, I did try to make peace with it in those weeks. I told myself, maybe they're right. Maybe a big house full of grandchildren's chaos isn't where a woman my age is supposed to be. Maybe there's a version of this where I gracefully step aside and everyone is happier for it. I looked at a few small one-bedroom places. I looked, God help me, at one of those retirement communities Michael mentioned, with a bingo hall and a wellness center that was really just a room with 3 treadmills in it. I ended up choosing a modest one-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from the house, above a small bakery. It was clean, quiet, affordable on my fixed income. And I remember standing in it the day I signed the lease, alone, in a space smaller than my old bedroom closet had felt, thinking, this is what easier for everyone looks like from the inside. Moving day itself is a blur in some ways and painfully sharp in others. I remember the movers. I hired my own. I didn't want my children carrying my life out of that house piece by piece. There was something about that I couldn't bear, loading up 38 years of memories into boxes that all looked the same from the outside. I remember Ava, my granddaughter, 11 years old by then, standing in the driveway asking me, with real confusion in her voice, "Grandma, why do you have to go? Did we do something wrong?" And here's the thing that still, to this day, makes my chest tighten when I think about it. I didn't have an honest answer for her, because the honest answer, Grandma got old and stopped being useful enough to keep around, wasn't something an 11-year-old should have to carry. So I told her I was excited for my own little place, that I'd still see her every week, that this was a good thing. I smiled while I said it. I have gotten very good, over the years, at smiling through things. I remember handing Michael the extra set of house keys, the ones I'd had made decades earlier for emergencies, on the porch, because he'd mentioned needing them for the contractors. I remember he hugged me and said, "This is going to be so good for you, Mom. You'll see." And I remember thinking, standing there with my 2 suitcases, how strange it is that the people who love us most can sometimes be the ones who hurt us the deepest, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of blindness, a failure to imagine that the person who's always taken care of everyone might, herself, need taking care of. I drove to that apartment above the bakery by myself. Nobody came to help me unpack. I sat that first night on a folding chair in an empty living room, surrounded by boxes, and I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since Frank's funeral. Not loud, dramatic crying, just quiet, exhausted tears, the kind that come when your body finally has permission to feel something it's been holding back for weeks. The first few months in that apartment were, without question, the loneliest of my entire life. Lonelier, even, than the early days after Frank passed, because at least then I still had my house, my routines, my sense of who I was in the world. Now I had none of it. I'd wake up in a quiet, unfamiliar room, make coffee for one, and have absolutely nowhere I needed to be, and nobody who needed me to be there. I want to be honest with you about something that I think a lot of people my age understand, but don't talk about enough. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing your usefulness had become your whole identity. I didn't just miss my house. I missed being needed. I missed being the person everyone came to. And without that, for a while, I genuinely didn't know who I was. There was a stretch of about 6 weeks where I barely left that apartment except to buy groceries. I watched a lot of daytime television. I ate meals standing at the kitchen counter because setting the little table for one felt unbearably sad. My daughter Rachel called sometimes, my son David more often than the others, but the calls felt like check-ins on a project, rather than conversations with a mother. "How's the apartment, Mom? Getting settled okay?" And I'd say yes, because what else was I going to say? The turning point, and I've thought about this a lot since, came from the most unexpected place. The bakery downstairs. I'd walk past it every day. This little place run by a woman named Carol, maybe 15 years younger than me. And one morning, out of pure loneliness more than anything else, I went in and struck up a conversation. Told her I'd just moved in upstairs. She mentioned, almost in passing, that her assistant baker had just quit, and she was scrambling to keep up with orders for an upcoming wedding. Now, here's something I hadn't mentioned to you yet, because it hadn't seemed relevant to the story until this exact moment. Before I ever sat behind a desk on that army base at 19 years old, before Frank, before any of it, I trained, briefly, to be a pastry chef. Life took me in a different direction. That secretarial job came with steady pay and benefits a young apprentice baker's wage never could have matched, and one thing led to another. Marriage, kids, decades of office work that paid the bills more reliably than a bakery ever would have. But that skill, that love of it, never fully left me. For decades it lived quietly in the form of birthday cakes and holiday cookies for my own family, a little joy tucked into the corners of a busy life. I told Carol, half joking, that I used to train as a pastry chef many years ago, and she looked at me, really looked at me, the way almost nobody had looked at me in months, and said, "Well, don't just stand there. Come show me what you've got." I spent the next 4 hours in that bakery kitchen, in an apron that wasn't mine, doing something with my hands that felt, for the first time since moving day, like me. Not Eleanor the mother who'd been asked to leave, not Eleanor the grandmother whose usefulness had apparently run out. Just Eleanor, who happened to be very, very good with a piping bag. Carol asked me back the next day, and the day after that. Within a month, I was working part-time at the bakery, 3 mornings a week, and something in me that had gone quiet for a long time started, slowly, to wake back up. Here's the thing about rebuilding a life at 66 years old that nobody tells you. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in small ones, stacked up over time, until one day you look back and realize the person you are now bears almost no resemblance to the person who sat crying on a folding chair 6 months earlier. Working at that bakery did something for me beyond the paycheck, small as it was. It gave me back a version of myself that existed before I was anyone's mother, before I was defined by what I could provide for other people. Carol and I became close, the kind of friendship that sneaks up on you at an age when you think you're done making new friends. Through her, I met other women in the neighborhood, a retired nurse, a widow who ran the flower shop 2 doors down, a woman my age who taught watercolor classes at the community center. For the first time in years, I had a life that belonged entirely to me. About 8 months after I moved out, Carol made me an offer I hadn't expected. She wanted to expand, open a second small counter specializing in custom cakes, the kind of elaborate wedding and celebration cakes I used to make for my own family, and she asked if I'd want to run it. Not as an employee, as a partner. I had some savings, a little equity from selling off some old investments Frank and I had made decades earlier, enough to buy into a modest stake in that expansion. I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence. Some habits, I suppose, don't change. That little cake counter, we called it Eleanor's Corner, which still to this day makes me a little embarrassed and a little proud in equal measure, did well. Better than well, actually. Within a year, word had gotten around the whole county about the retired grandmother who makes cakes like a professional pastry chef, and we were booking out weddings 4 months in advance. Now, here's where I want to tell you what happened with my children, because I know that's the part you're waiting for. About 1 year and 2 months after I moved out, Michael called me. Not casually, not the way our calls had become. Brief, obligatory. This call, I could tell from the first "Hey Mom," was different. He said the renovation had gone way over budget, that between the construction costs and Rachel's marriage finally falling apart under all the stress of the crowded house, the very thing they'd told me they wanted to fix by moving me out, things had gotten hard. Really hard. He said Rachel had actually moved out with her kids to a small rental across town, and now it was just Michael's family rattling around in a half-renovated house that had eaten through most of their savings. And then he asked, quietly, in a voice I hadn't heard from my son since he was a teenager admitting he'd wrecked the car, he asked if there was any chance I'd consider moving back. "The house feels wrong without you, Mom," he said. "It never really worked the way we thought it would. I want to tell you, there was a part of me, an old part, the part that spent decades believing my worth was measured by how needed I was, that felt a flash of something close to relief when he said that. Vindication, maybe. Here's the thing about being pushed aside by people you love. Some quiet corner of you spends a long time waiting to be proven right about how much they still needed you. But I sat with that phone call for 3 full days before I answered him. And in those 3 days, I thought about the folding chair. I thought about the 11 months of quiet grief. I thought about who I'd become in that apartment above the bakery, a woman with her own income, her own friendships, her own name on a business, for the first time in her entire life. Eleanor's corner. Not Frank's wife, not Michael's mother, mine. So here's what I told him, and I want to share it with you, because I think it's the most important thing in this whole story. I said, "Michael, I love you, and I love that house, and I'm not angry anymore. But I'm not moving back in as your mother who does everyone's dishes and disappears when it's convenient. If we do this, it has to be different." We talked, over the following weeks, about what different meant. I did move back into the house eventually, about 4 months later, but not the way I'd left it. I kept my apartment lease for another year, just in case, which I know surprised Michael, but I needed to know I could walk out that door again if I ever needed to. I insisted on a real conversation, on paper, about the house. My name stayed the only one on the deed, and this time everyone understood that clearly, and I kept my stake in the bakery. 3 mornings a week, I still put on that apron and pipe buttercream roses onto wedding cakes, and nobody in that house gets to make me feel guilty for it. So here's what I want to leave you with. If you're watching this, and any part of my story sounds familiar to you, maybe you've spent your whole life being the one everyone depends on, and you're starting to wonder, quietly, in the back of your mind, what happens to you if that ever changes. Maybe you're already living some version of what I lived through, feeling like a line item in somebody else's ledger instead of the woman who built the whole house they're standing in. Here's the thing I'd tell you, from the other side of it. Being needed and being valued are not the same thing, and it took losing everything, at 66 years old, standing on a porch with 2 suitcases, to teach me the difference. I don't regret the years I spent as the anchor of that house. I loved every one of them, truly. But I regret how completely I let that role swallow the rest of who I was, until the day somebody decided the role wasn't needed anymore, and I had nothing left of myself to stand on. You are not just useful. You are not just the person who holds everyone else together. Whatever that thing is that you set aside 30, 40 years ago, whatever version of yourself got quietly folded into being somebody's mother, somebody's wife, somebody's grandmother, I promise you, it's still in there. Mine turned out to be a piping bag and a love of butter and sugar I hadn't touched since I was 19 years old. Yours might be something else entirely, but it's there. I think about my grandmother Rose sometimes still. The promise I made her when I was 7 years old, sitting outside her bedroom door. I understand now that the promise I should have made wasn't just to protect her from ever feeling unwelcome in someone else's house. It was to make sure I never let myself forget I was allowed to build a life and a home that belonged to nobody but me. If this story reminded you of your own house, your own children, your own porch you're standing on right now, wondering what comes next, I want you to know it's not the end of your story. Sometimes the door closing behind you is the only thing that could have opened the one in front of you. Thank you for sitting with me today. Take care of yourselves, and don't you dare let anyone convince you that you've stopped mattering.